morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming today. I want to welcome docents, DITs, Maritime Museum guides, volunteers, Society of Fellows members. We've got a great crowd today. And we're going to start off with Gaylord Torrence, the Curator of American Indian Art. And he's going to do a lecture this morning that will end at 10:30, and another lecture this afternoon from 1 to 2:30. You all are all welcome to attend both of those. If you are not a docent, then we need you to leave the building immediately after both of these lectures, since we're not open to the public today. Half of the group of docents will go with Gaylord immediately following this morning's lecture up to the galleries for a very quick walkthrough. So if you have a pinkish agenda, you'll see on there that that's what you need to do after this. It's going to be a short, brief walkthrough, single file, really quick. We need you to meet in the American Rotunda, so you can take the elevator just outside here, go on up, and meet Gaylord in the Rotunda. In the afternoon, if you have a yellow agenda, you'll see that that's your first item after the afternoon lecture. Once that's done, then you'll come back down from the galleries and you'll rotate between Atkins Auditorium and the training room. We'll have some images up for you, and you see in your packets the workbook. Images from the Woodlands will be in here. Images from planes will be in the training room. You can take your own time, move at your own pace, work individually, work in groups. It's up to you. For those going into Lens 2, we need you to go immediately into Lens 2, and we'll set everything up for you there. I'd also like to introduce Emily Black. She works in public programs and interpretation, the division or a department within education, and she'll be helping us out today. So thanks, Emily, for helping. And I'd like to introduce Gaylord Torrence. Thanks so much for being here to set these beautiful objects and galleries up for us.
Morning. Well, I have to admit to you that when I was a professor, I did. You can't hear me? No. You still can't hear me? No. You still can't hear me? Yes. Kevin's tricking me with the microphone again. Okay. I was going to say, when I was a professor, I did everything I could possibly do to never schedule a lecture class before 10 in the morning. And here we are. I thought I'd left all of that behind. And I also understand that you as docents have not been through this particular format before. Is that correct? Where we're trying to do everything at once. Not at once, but we're trying to cover a great deal of material in a fairly short period of time. And it's going to be a real sweep through all of these objects. I've never given this particular kind of talk before. Just by way of a broad kind of overview, there are 200 objects in this installation, maybe 201, 199, but we're hovering right around 200. About half of them have been brought into the museum within the last 7 years. So this is going to be, in many ways, a new collection for many of you. About 60 of the objects are from the original collection. Prior to the Donald Jones bequest, there are probably around 15 that come from Casey Jones, and then about 25 loans from both institutions here in the area and 2 private collectors. So that's kind of the breakdown of the material that you will see. One of the questions that you may get, because it's already come to me, is where do these new acquisitions come from? Who does the curator buy from? Who does the museum buy from? And generally, these new acquisitions have come from collectors, private collectors, where they have usually been in collections for many, many years. Sometimes they come from galleries or auction houses, although in this case not very often. Most of these things that I've acquired have come out of private collections. And then there are a number of things that have been purchased directly from contemporary Native American artists or from galleries that represent them. And in saying that, it's clear that the intent of this installation is to span a huge diversity of cultures and an enormous period of time in one installation. And as large as this installation is, we're really hitting the high points, in a sense. The oldest objects on view date around 2500 BC. The most recent were made last year. Most of the collection upstairs dates from the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, essentially the historical period. Should also mention that as I'm moving through this, if you have questions at any point, please raise your hand, or if I don't see you, really raise your hand, and we'll kind of attend to those as we move along. We're going to begin our discussion with the woodland cultures, and let's see. Yes.
Move the mic down closer to you.
There. Can you hear that better? Okay. All right. This is the map of Indian culture areas of North America. Brings me to another question. There are going to be some people that say, are you including pre-Columbian art? In other words, art south of the border, Central American, South American, and we are not in the installation. Everything on view comes from North America, north of the border, Mexican border. And it is often the case with Native American arts as they've developed in recognition. There are various nomenclatures. Someone has said, wait a minute, you're showing art from North America. What about Mexico? That's North America too. It is, but in the field generally, Native North American indicates those groups of people that lived north of the border. Although in pre-contact times there was a lot of exchange between those cultures below and those that existed in the lower half of the United States, particularly in the Southwest and the Mississippian Valley. The woodland area, as you can see, it's quite large. It covers almost half of North America. It's large enough to be considered by many scholars in terms of 3 or 4 subdivisions, depending on who's doing the analysis. But generally speaking, in the historical period, the Southeast, the Northeast, the Great Lakes, and then the adjacent prairie areas, which would occupy basically where Kansas City is, that area right between what's described on this map as the woodlands and the prairies. North is the subarctic. Some scholars regard that as part of the woodland culture as well. We're treating it somewhat differently here within the installation. Basically, as you know, with a culture area, it refers to a geographic region that supported Native groups that were similar enough in their economy, their subsistence patterns, generally speaking, their worldview, their religious ceremonies and concepts, and their artistic traditions to be treated or viewed or understood as a single group, and that's true with the woodlands. All of these peoples practiced hunting, seasonal gathering, and combined that with agriculture. They usually lived in semi-permanent villages part of the year that were returned to in the spring for planting. During the winter, they traveled in smaller groups throughout the territory. The land was originally covered with forests. As you know, there were waterways throughout. There were no natural divisions, and so there was a lot of interaction, a lot of trade. It was a homogeneous area in many ways that other regions, such as the Northwest Coast or California, were not, where those regions were pretty much isolated by natural barriers. I have a few pre-contact works on view. We're simply touching on that area. It's all of these areas that I'm going to talk about are incredibly rich in terms of what was produced, the various forms. What we've tried to do in this installation is, in a sense, show the principal artistic expressions from every culture area with as many great works as we possibly could. This is arguably the finest Mississippian head pot in existence. It was created in the Mississippian culture about 500 years ago. This culture disappeared shortly after the arrival of the Europeans. This particular work is, it's probably a portrait of a venerated ancestor. Many of these were thought to be the heads of slain enemies, and they were. We think that both kinds of representations were created. And let me ask you here, you're all going to get, I assume, copies of text panels, copies of label copy, all of that. Is that, Helen, is that true? Okay. Do you have that already? Okay. Because I feel like in trying to brush through this, I'm going to touch on a lot of that material. Maybe that's good. Do you think so? Yes. Okay. All right. It's in perfect condition. It's the lines that you see across the face represent facial tattooing, which was a very common fashion throughout much of the Woodland area. The hair that you can't see is a kind of roached headdress. On the reverse side, you can see a kind of scalp lock that is present through incising. The head is painted red, which would have been typical for the culture. The holes in the ears were originally intended for suspensions of earrings, again representing the kind of fashion of this culture. It really is one of the great portraits, I think, in American Indian art, and that was its intention. I have only one piece of, actually two pieces of flint that I'm going to show to represent that enormous tradition. This pair, they were found by a farmer plowing a field, I think around 50, 60 years ago, maybe 70 years ago. He was plowing his field with mules, and he looked down and he saw one of these. He picked it up. He looked down on the other side. He saw the other one. He picked that up. These things are legendary within the field of prehistoric material of this kind. They're called the Sedalia Points. They're from the Hartman collection. And you don't get a sense of scale here, but they're each about 10, 11 inches long. This is about a third longer than any other known points, broken or unbroken. These are essentially in pristine condition. They must have had a ceremonial purpose. They're beautifully and flawlessly made, flaked. The rippling is perfect across the surface. They're simply very, very beautiful objects that must have been objects of prestige, objects of ceremonial use. They're too large to have functioned effectively as a projectile point or the head of a spear, anything like that. They were probably carried. Did I miss something? I did, sorry. On your right is the second Mississippian jar that we have. This is also a legendary piece. It comes out of the Hathcock collection. It's a kneeling human figure. Represents a woman, we believe, a humpback woman. This is a depiction that was frequently created in Mississippian cultures, and it's believed by scholars that this represents a female deity. I think in the label copy I say known by many names depending on the culture, but it basically is a Mother Earth figure. And this particular iconography shows up over and again. This is probably the finest one that anyone has ever seen. Again, it's in unbroken, unrestored condition. It's kind of an amazing stylization of the human figure, this globular body, the beautiful rib cage. and then the delicacy of the collarbones, the breasts, the arms, the hands, and then the very sensitive modeling of the face renders this, like the head pot, a very compelling human portrait. It has tremendous presence. Yes?
Could you please say where, like regionally, each was found, if we know that, as we're going through?
Sure. Actually, this was both, this and the head pot were found in Arkansas. The head pot was found right up in the northeastern corner of Arkansas, right across the line from southeast Missouri. And this is from the Bradley site, and I believe that is central Arkansas. I'm not certain. Mississippian culture spread throughout much of the Mississippi Valley, but a lot of these effigy pots were created right within this kind of southern, southeastern Missouri, northeastern Arkansas area. By the way, there are only, I believe, 163 head pots that have been documented so far out of the many, many, many thousands of vessels that have been recovered over time. So they were rare even when they were created. The last two prehistoric objects, and I would refer, I'm old and I refer to these things as prehistoric, and that is something that we shouldn't be doing. We should call them pre-contact. One of the great things about recent scholarship is that it reveals more and more the kind of rich histories that Native peoples possess. And to refer to something as prehistoric really suggests that there was no history before Europeans and other outsiders arrived, which is not the case. So these are the last two pre-contact pieces. To your left is a shell mask gorget. This is also from the Mississippian culture. It's about 3.5 inches high. We think that these objects were associated with war ceremonials within the Mississippian culture, who were, by the way, quite a warlike culture. There was a lot of the imagery, a lot of the iconography in their art relates to not only their ceremonial life, but also warfare. This piece is, it's a curious piece because, first of all, it's in extraordinary condition. Most of these objects are found in the Midwest, in this area, and are mostly kind of badly deteriorated from being buried in the ground. This piece was found, I was going to say on the surface, it was actually found along the bank of the Missouri River, right up on the South and North Dakota line, in a proto-historic Arikara site, which is a Plains Indian culture. And it reveals how far Mississippian culture had spread by the 1600s. And it's probably when this piece may date a little bit earlier, maybe around 1350 to 1550, right in that area. But because the soil up there is so sandy and does not retain water, and because this piece probably was found or was deposited on the surface, not in a burial, and then it did wash into the Missouri River, it still has its polished surface. And it's, I think, as a work of art, it's a haunting, very, very enigmatic, beautiful kind of object. It's taken from a shell, one of those large conch shells that comes from the coast, which again indicates the kind of trade patterns that existed in North America in pre-European times. They simply whacked off one side, which gives the piece that distinctive shape, carved the surface in relief to reveal just the nose. That's the only feature other than the two eyes that are drilled. It's hard to see in this image, but you'll notice when you study the object right across the top, there's a thin line, and the top was kind of scalloped to represent hair. That's nearly worn away from wear and long usage. And then on the far image is an axe that was found right here in the Kansas City area. It's from the Nebo culture. And I wanted at least one object in the installation that revealed the early consideration for, I'll say, artistic invention, sensitivity, concerns, belief, in something that was purely functional. As I think I've talked about before with you, the feature of American Indian art that must be brought forward over and over again is that everything that you're seeing in these galleries was functional in either a religious sense or in a utilitarian way. So this is an axe that was used to beat down trees and whatever else was necessary. It's heavy. It's made of very, very fine-grained granite, very hard stone. It would have taken hundreds, thousands of hours to produce this thing. But the maker of it, as you can see, was very concerned with proportion, with the beautiful interplay of convex and concave form. It's simply sensitively, beautifully made, far beyond what was required for the function of the object. So there was a sense of a beauty, a sense of importance, a sense of making something, I think, out of love and care that would have been used every day. And this we see in a lot of the early pre-contact material, and of course it carries through into historical times as well. Okay. The first things I'm going to show you from the historic period are from the Northeast. And excuse me just a moment. Okay. I think many of you may have seen this coat that's close to me up in Kirkwood during the 75th anniversary preview, I'll say. It's a magnificent buffalo skin coat from the Western Ojibwa people. It dates 1789, was collected by an Englishman who took it back to England. This coat surfaced about 1976. It was in sacred circles. It was in a collection from that point until it was given to the museum in the last 2 years. It's a magnificent thing, as you can see. It's one of 19 that are known in the world. It's arguably one of the 2 or 3 finest artistically. It's painted, decorated with woven and embroidered porcupine quill embroidery. Heavily, heavily painted. And in the label copy, you'll see that I describe this in terms of two basic things. That it is a great singular object that represents the kind of cultural interaction embodied within the fur trade of colonial North America. And it also is a mixture of woodlands and plains Indian artistic traditions. And that's because the Ojibwa people, this particular group, it's known that they would make forays out onto the plains to hunt buffalo, and then come back to the woodlands for their permanent villages. They would do this seasonally, but at a certain point, it's known that some of these Ojibwa groups stayed out on the plains, and they were interacting undoubtedly with plains cultures that lived there at the time, and the artistic influences began to blend. And so, for instance, the broad band of painting that you see running down the front and across the bottom is something that would be more typical of a Plains Indian buffalo robe. And then the linear painting with circles and dots and all of that going on around the back of this thing is something that one would find within Woodlands painting traditions. The quill work is the same way. The epaulets are incredibly fine, woven porcupine quill work. The quill work running down the arms and across the back is something that you would see in a Plains Indian shirt. So the garment really mixes the artistic traditions of those two peoples, the Eastern Plains and the Western Woodlands. And then, of course, the thing is cut like a military coat from the 1700s. These coats were known as captain's coats. When the English and other Europeans came in and began to establish the fur trade in North America, it was the practice to present band leaders with military coats as the beginnings of the kind of gift-giving tradition that would establish formal alliances and connections. It didn't have to do with trade. It had to do with gifting and honoring another person. And this was a very, very traditional way by which groups establish connection. It wasn't long before Native peoples began to create similar garments to present to white dignitaries. And all of these that are known to exist, all of them that have, let me rephrase that, all of them that have documentation where we know when and why it was collected, they were all presented as gifts to white dignitaries. And we can assume that this coat was as well. It's in superb condition. It's made of buffalo hide, again, reflecting Plains tradition, and is one of the key pieces in the collection. On the far image is another great object. It's a ball head club, and this is a fundamental weapon found throughout the Northeast and the Great Lakes. All of these cultures were, I will say, warlike peoples. In other words, intertribal wars existed before the coming of Europeans, and once the Europeans were here, those continued and extended as well. And the creation of weapons that were not only beautifully made and perfectly functional, often became elevated to, I'll say, sculptural works of art. And this is one of the, it's a superb example of the kind of sculptural tradition, small-scale sculptural tradition that existed throughout the Woodlands. It's a highly abstract thing. It's beautifully balanced. I mean, you just hold it and you want to hit someone. It has that, it just has that. It actually, the balance of this thing, when you hold it, it wants to thrust forward through its own weight. Would have been very, very effective in hand-to-hand fighting, but it's also beautifully proportioned, beautifully finished. And this particular piece is quite ancient. It probably dates in the early 1700s. I'd say 1700 to 1750, which is 100 years earlier than most that are in collections today. It's a well-known piece in terms of the collections that it comes from. I don't know that you can see in this image very well, but the iconography of this piece is that of a creature that is holding the ball within its mouth. And this was a very, very tough thing to photograph. I don't think it's successful, what we ended up with entirely. But if you examine this, you see what appear to be very abstract representations of teeth, of ears, of a tautness in the curvature of that club's form. The distension of the lower jaw, which someone here at the museum reminded me, I don't know if distension is the proper word, but a person said to me, have you ever seen a cat get hold of something? And its lower jaw opens. And anyway, and then I got an email showing a sculpture of a lion that was killing an antelope, and it had exactly the same configuration. And that is what's going on here. There is this creature holding the ball within its mouth. The creature undoubtedly was a spirit helper to the man who owned the club. And it's very, very dark from its patina, beautifully worn. You'll see it. It's one of the most important woodland sculptural pieces in the collection. Here are two very early examples of tourist art. They're from the Huron culture, made by Huron women. The Ursuline nuns up in Quebec opened a nunnery, a school to instruct young Huron girls in really a way to produce income, in a sense. And it was a very important source of income for the Huron peoples, which by this time had been knocked around pretty hard by the Iroquois and the kind of cultural changes that were going on. And basically the Ursuline nuns, they were French, they brought with them the tradition of French Renaissance embroidery that was done in silk thread. The native women used moose hair, which was a very, very fine hair that accepted dye quite nicely. The moccasins close to me are done entirely in moose hair on black dyed leather, which is a traditional background material. Gives a beautiful kind of background for the soft coloration of the moose hair. And you can see the designs are very European-like. They're floral designs. I would say that when floral designs or floral abstractions existed, certainly in pre-contact times, but native artists, and you find this as you move through all of the culture areas, are like artists anywhere. They were observant, they were interested in new ideas, new materials. They balanced that against ongoing traditions. And so there was constantly a sense of invention that was occurring, and this whole tradition exploded. And these things were made for sale to outsiders. Much of this material was taken back to England, and where some of it is recovered today, including these moccasins, I believe. The designs are, in this sense, very European-like, but as you go through the galleries, you will see floral designs in the plains, in the plateau area, in the subarctic, and even as far as the northwest coast. So this tradition of European-style floral design really kind of moved across North America, largely with the fur trade initially, and then more permanent influences from that point. The little bag that you see, it's a little kind of purse-like thing. It's an absolute jewel. It's a little bit later. It dates about 1850. The moccasins date about 1825, 1830. And the amazing thing about it is that the moose hair embroidery, which constitutes the floral design in the central panel, is in absolutely pristine, unfaded condition. So you can get a sense of the richness of color in these original works. The moccasins are faded somewhat, and that's fairly typical. A lot of American Indian art, particularly porcupine quill work, some kinds of textiles and moose hair embroidery is very susceptible to light, and things can fade rather quickly. This little purse is an absolute jewel. Yes?
What was used for the dyes on the moose hair?
The dyes on the moose hair were native dyes initially, and I'll just say there were a variety of sources. I would call it native dyes, both vegetal and mineral sources for these, some animal as well. Another tourist object close to me, this is a quill-decorated birch bark box from the Micmac people of Nova Scotia. There's evidence that these were created for native use, but very early on, say by the early 1800s, numbers of these were being produced for both colonial settlers and for visitors to the continent that were returning to Europe. And again, you have here native women who took a native form of expression and elaborated it, focused it in a way that was, how can I say it, desirable to European clients and Euro-American clients. This is a birch bark box. It has a lid, and it is totally covered with dyed porcupine quills. And again, native dyes. About 1850, Generally, one begins to see the introduction of European dyes, and this increases depending on the region of the country during the last half of the 19th century. And it has many manifestations depending on the culture area and the kind of art form that one is considering. But this particular piece is, first of all, a lot of these things are fragile. They're susceptible not only to light but insects. So finding one in this condition is very, very nice. The design is intricate. It's geometric, as you can see. Very simple palette, but a beautiful patterning and Okay. On your right is another key piece in the woodland area, and it's we call it a tab bag, and this is, let's see. Well, never mind, I was going to show you. If you look at the broad, this is porcupine quill work on black dyed hide. Everything below that broad band of quill work, how can I describe this? You see the split in the design? Okay, that also represents two rectangular tabs that hang down, quite possibly representing a highly stylized animal skin. Very, very stylized. But this is a belt pouch. We don't know what they were intended for. I believe there are about 19 or 20 in existence. It's thought that they come out of the Ohio Valley, which in the late 1700s had become a settlement location for many of the refugee tribes that were being pushed westward after the Revolution and after the opening of the West to colonial settlement. These bags were undoubtedly made to contain sacred materials, perhaps medicines. So I say there are about 20 in existence. This is, I think, generally considered to be one of the top three in terms of its condition and the elaboration of its design. And the design itself, this is something that one could spend a lot of time with, because the fundamental religious concepts of many Woodlands cultures are expressed in this bag. Woodlands peoples essentially saw the universe, saw the world as a balance between powers, the above world, the below world, and then the plane of existence that we occupy. And that latter plane is represented by the broad band of quill work that follows the center of this piece. Above you can see two thunderers, who were the most important spirit beings or manitous of the upper world. You can begin to see two kind of arcing lines on either side, and those are also a celestial symbol. The flap is pulled forward, as you would see it if it were worn over a belt, and you can see two humans whose hands are joined, part of a bird in profile, and a plant. The plant is probably a medicinal plant. The humans may very well be proteges of thunderbirds, thunderers in another form. The bird in profile is also an upper world manitou. Then below, at the very bottom, you see two turtles, and they're not identical, but they both have horns. And within Woodlands, and in fact throughout much of North America, the addition of horns on a creature indicates a sacred state. So these are not normal turtles. These are turtles that are recognized as spirit beings, sacred powers, manitous. They're one of the underworld manitous that were regarded as very, very important. And then running around the border of this entire bag are wavy lines. And within much woodlands and plains iconography, the creation of wavy lines means the transmission of spiritual power. It means spiritual energy. This thing is alive with energy. And in a sense, this drawing, which is executed in porcupine quill work, is really a kind of cosmological diagram for woodlands, people's woodlands religion. I'm looking at the time, and I'm spending too much time on stuff. Sorry. What are we going to do here? Yeah. Well, I'll have to move faster. Sorry. So, all right. Moving into the southeast, we have 4 objects. Thank you. Close to me is a shoulder bag, bandolier bag. These were made throughout the southeast, and it's interesting because all of these bags, which were made by the Creek, the Cherokee, the Seminole primarily, those were the primary producers of these. Everything is made of European manufacture. They're patterned after the shot pouches that were worn by colonial soldiers. They became an item of men's formal apparel. And they had many kind of paramutations throughout the different woodlands regions. And so you can look at bandolier bags. We'll have 3 on view, 2 from the Great Lakes, and then this one from the southeast. It's, I won't go into the symbolism of the design except to say that on the one side you see the circle with the cross, which is fundamentally a kind of earth symbol. The swastika design that you see going up the other side is generally thought to represent the 4 winds, the 4 directions. So in this highly abstracted way, you have, again, a kind of reference to powers and beliefs that extend beyond this object. And I'll just say here that I think one of the things that has kept our culture from recognizing Native American art for so many decades is the fact, again, that these things are functional. And in Euro-American tradition, certainly in European tradition, the arts were divided. They were hierarchical. Painting and sculpture made for contemplation were created just for that. They were regarded as the highest arts. And other things like bags, baskets, pots, textiles, these things were regarded as crafts. And I think that broadly speaking, the idea is that painting and sculpture could hold ideas. You know, they expressed meaning. They held they held the meanings, the beliefs that were most important to the culture. And the other things were useful items used in day-to-day life. In Native American art, you find these 2 things perfectly and beautifully merged, so that functional objects become a principal means of artistic expression, expression which holds intellectual ideas, expressive belief, certainly the loftiest and important concepts within the culture. And that's beautifully represented in this shoulder bag. So what you have the 4 winds, you have the ritual center of the universe, the cross and the circle, a very, very universal form in North American Indian art, hence the name of the exhibition, Sacred Circles. And then everything below is it a representation of power? Are they plant forms? Certainly highly abstracted, but filled with a kind of energy and purpose that elevates it from being purely decorative. Now, on the far slide is we don't use slides anymore, I'm sorry. Is a pot, and it was made by a lady named Maud Welch. and it was done around 1935. Again, it was made for an outside market. It's a wonderful thing. It's a pot that is created with a couple of snakes that appear to be moving in and out of it. And one of the things that I'm trying to represent in the collection is the kind of passage of artistic forms through the 20th century. A lot of museums that are collecting historical things, showing historical things, and contemporary things sort of drop away about 1920 and then suddenly reemerge around 1990. And I have actually included objects from every decade of the 20th century throughout this installation. And it's again, one could take any single area and trace the evolution that occurred. Of course, the arts changed throughout the 19th, earlier than that, it was always in change, but especially throughout the late 19th and then 20th centuries. But art did not stop in many cultures. Sometimes forms were continued in a very traditional way, other times new forms like this emerged. The Cherokee had a great tradition of pottery. They pretty much lost it. This was a revival thing that was done, I believe, in the late 1920s, started by two women on the Qualla Reservation in North Carolina, and they were the beginnings of a tradition that was quite strong for many, many years. Two baskets, great plated basketry tradition of the Southeast. Probably best, the pinnacle of the tradition, we'll call it that way, was created by the Chitimacha people of Louisiana. The image close to me is a piece that I dated 1875. It's hard to know. The oldest documented piece we have that is identical to this in technique is about 250 years old. It probably emerges from pre-contact times. It's a long-standing tradition. Different forms were made. Certainly in the 19th century, these started, Chitimacha women began to produce these for an outside market. A lot of these, I think, occupied space on the dressers of Euro-American women and held very special things, very much like the Birch Bark Box. This basket is called double weave. Basically, there's an inner basket that is woven with no design, and then this outer basket with this highly complex, almost pre-contact Mississippian sensibility, which is called alligator entrails. That's the name of the design. It's a traditional design. It's still produced to some extent. Anyway, this is very, there's a lot of fading on this basket, but the intricacy of the pattern, I think, is quite beautiful. And then on the far image is a piece that was made in 2007 by Melissa Darden, who's a contemporary maker, one of the few that still practices this tradition. And I think it's nice to have the two side by side. This bowl is, I'm swinging back around, it's from the Northeast, although wooden feast bowls were created throughout the Woodlands area and into the plains. They were used in pretty much every religious ceremony. Consecrated food was consumed and great bowls were created for that purpose. Many of these bowls have effigy forms that rise up off the rim, such as this one. Depicts, it's a Brancusi-like depiction of a raptor, probably an eagle, maybe a hawk, but certainly a thunderbird, a manitou. So that kind of symbolism gets carried right into the creation of these implements as well. This piece is especially notable, I should say, because it's amazingly early. Most old wooden bowls date from the 19th century. There's every indication that this could date from the 1600s. It's extremely early. It came out of Massachusetts. It's identical stylistically to some of the earliest bowls that were collected up in that region early on during colonial times. You can see this bowl has been broken from use and used and used and used. It's like an ancient tea bowl that has just been used maybe for 200 years. Also is quite large. It's amazing in scale. Two from basically this region of the country, the Santee Sioux, western Minnesota, again with effigy forms, and dating about 200 years later. These both date from about around the mid-19th century. Bowls had their spoons. People usually would attend a religious feast with a special spoon that had an image that had some kind of meaning for them. And usually these images were animals. Sometimes they were manitous, sometimes they were straightforward animals. Here in the Midwest, a lot of times horses were used to decorate the ends of handles. This unique spoon, which was made on the Meskwaki settlement around 1950 by Eugene Capello, depicts a German Luger pistol on the handle. I've never seen anything like it. And so anyway, I was able to speak to Eugene Capello's nephew and learned that this was made for one of Eugene's uncles who'd served during World War II. And suddenly things fell into place. This is a captured enemy weapon, which is one of the war honors that was traditionally recognized within many of these cultures, particularly out onto the plains. And I think there are two things represented here. One, the continuation of a tradition of representing one's war honors in a public way, which is still very much alive today. And secondly, the importance, the respect with which veterans are held within Native American cultures. I believe that Native Americans, as a part of our population, have the highest percentage per capita of service in the military of any group. And so it's still very much a part of culture, Native culture today. And again, this is one of those pieces that is at that time a very modern day version, a modern day interpretation of a long, long tradition, one that goes back, I'm sure, before European contact. Ribbon applique is from the Osage people that occupied Kansas City during the historical period. This basically all of Missouri and out into eastern Kansas. A woman's robe called a friendship blanket. Ribbon applique that was developed in the early 1800s. This piece probably dates around the turn of the century, around 1900. Worn on ceremonial occasions, special occasions. The beaded hands represent friendship, according to Osage tradition. Here are two Midwestern bandolier bags. The one close to me is a very special bag. It's one of three of the earliest bandolier bags in existence. Dates from 1850. It's actually dated in the beadwork. There's a man's name, Joseph Landry, and the date in 1850. It was undoubtedly a presentation piece or commissioned by him perhaps for some special occasion, but one of the most important Great Lakes pieces that we have in the collection. And then on the far image, a more recent version, probably made about 50 years later. And here I think the Native woman that produced this was looking not at the kind of woodland floral traditions that had emerged by this time, but rather European toll painting, European folk design. And she may have been looking at a magazine, she may have been looking at something from one of the nearby European communities that had settled in Minnesota or Iowa, Wisconsin. But again, it's someone looking at a culture outside of their own and interpreting what they see in relation to a traditional form. Two other pieces of beadwork, a pair of men's garters below, These are traditionally worn throughout the region. These are extremely early, probably 1820 to 1840. Finger woven. And then a knife sheath above, collected with the bandolier bag. Simply a delicate, nice early example. Here are two pieces off the Meskwaki settlement that both date from the 1920s. A pair of dance cuffs, which were emerging at that time as one of the principal forms of powwow regalia, still very much in use today. Meskwakis had their first powwow in 1913. They were influenced by many other tribes that were coming to their settlement, and some interesting things started to emerge out of that. The vest that you see is a fully beaded vest. This is a form that is unknown in traditional Meskwaki culture, and it only existed for about 10 years, I think, maybe 15 years when they were produced. But they were clearly made in imitation of Sioux or Lakota vests that were done on the Western Plains. So again, it's this notion of a woodland prairie culture looking at Plains tradition and then interpreting that art form in their own terms. Maybe that's further than you want to go with this, but I think what can be said here is that these ideas, these artistic ideas, moved around. They crossed boundaries. You will see when we go through the galleries today that although there are divisions, and there are, I think, logical divisions separating culture areas, the galleries are very open. When you're standing in Woodlands, you'll be looking through to the Plains, and beyond the Plains, you'll be looking through to the Southwest. And in many respects, that kind of permeability existed within artistic traditions, the ideas, forms, materials, all of that. And it's something that we want to represent, not only by the objects that we're showing, but also how we're showing them. The cuffs you can see depict the Great Seal of the United States. They're on a kind of opalescent gray ground. They have carnival glass in them. They're a purely modern version of, I think, the Thunderbird and actually the use of wampum at a much earlier time. This is a Health Guardian doll from the Delaware people who moved through various migrations from the east, ended up settling just across the line in Kansas for a period of time before going on to Oklahoma. This is a sacred object. It was owned by a family. This is called a Health Guardian doll, and it was believed to provide health, all the blessings of life, really. It was kept in a special trunk, which came with this doll, and every year it was honored with a feast, and it was danced, and it was given new clothing. And so this trunk is filled with clothing going back probably 100 years. The doll itself, I would say, I'm dating it around 1800. It could be actually 18th century. The clothing that she's wearing dates from around the mid-19th century. It's a rare object. It's interesting, when this went out for a show in Ohio a few years back, Delaware people that resided there brought some very small and wonderful items of clothing for this doll. Yeah. Two other great pieces of sculpture, a wooden pipe depicting a masked creature, a masked man or a Manitou holding a keg of liquor, probably rum. Disastrously, one of the early trade materials, but it was also used as a present. It was also used in a ceremonial context by the Wyandot people. And this pipe has been identified as such by the experts that know that culture. It's certainly Wyandotte or a related group, and very, very early, probably dates around 1750 to 1800. So very rare, beautiful, powerful little thing. The far image is a turtle, comes from the St. Joseph Museum, and it has a fascinating history as well. Woodlands peoples kept sacred bundles, which were an assemblage of sacred materials that had their origins in a vision. They were kept as a means of communication with the spirits, with the powers of the universe. They figured prominently into ceremonies, and the contents of these bundles were never intended for public view, only those that should be attending a ceremony and should be seeing these things. In the early 20th century, there was a guy up in Iowa, an anthropologist, who came to the Meskwaki settlement to study the religion. And he was working on language, he was working on songs and ceremonial sequences, and he was not allowed, of course, to see the actual bundles. But one of his principal informants, who was also a well-known sculptor in the area, carved replicas of the objects that were in the sacred bundles, and that's what this turtle is. It represents a Manitou spirit that would have been found in a bundle. It was done for an anthropologist to show what the thing was like. I've found about 6 of these. They're all roughly twice the size of the originals, I'm told. And they're all made out of walnut, and they're all very, very powerful carvings that were made basically to educate someone from the outside. These are 2 fascinating objects from the Potawatomi. I believe they were probably collected from the Prairie Potawatomi in Kansas. They're called prescription sticks, and they are 2 kind of batons of wood that are covered with incised imagery, all just lines and dots, but very specifically representing the kinds of plants that one would use for medicinal purposes. And so these are fundamentally memory aids. Singular plants are identified, and then groupings of plants are identified, grouped together through vertical lines with hatching that would separate the groups. And these would have been used by a healer, either a man or a woman. They basically recorded medicinal formula. One question that I've been asked that I cannot answer is why other tribes did not produce these as well. And whereas there was a pictographic tradition and a tradition of memory aid throughout much of the Great Lakes and into the prairies, only the Potawatomi seem to have produced this particular kind of memory aid. A gunstock club from the region. We believe that it may have belonged to Little Crow, who reluctantly led his people in the 1862 Minnesota Indian Wars. It's called a gunstock club. It's one of the principal types, other than the ball head, that were made. It's a functional club. It's seen a lot of use. It's also a beautiful sculptural form, carved with this amazing profile, kind of representing or resembling, I should say, the gun stock on a gun. It has a metal blade decorated with brass tacks and pigment. And then on the far image, one of the great, I think, Prairie and Great Lakes textiles in the collection. It's a finger-woven bag, storage bag. These were made for everyday use as well as the storage of ceremonial items. It's covered on one side with images of thunderbirds, and on the reverse side there are deer, spirit deer. We'll flip this bag at some point, probably within the next 6 months, and go back and forth. But this is very much within the tradition, except that it in a sense goes beyond the tradition. And I say that because when you see this real thing, you will see an amazing texture created by the technique of finger weaving. The experts that know this material could not figure out how this thing was made. In other words, this woman, in search of certain visual effects combining color and texture and imagery, invented a technique that extended beyond that which is usually seen, and the result is fantastic. This thing also is in nearly perfect condition. If it is faded, it doesn't look like it. It came from the Sauk people in Oklahoma, probably dates about 1875. We have some beautiful pipes, calumets actually, on the top, recognized by the cylindrical stem. Pipes, tobacco, the use of tobacco was central to Native American religious traditions. Most Native Americans, certainly all of the Woodlands and Plains peoples. This upper pipe was found in Illinois. We don't know the tribe. It's about 30-some inches long, so it clearly had a ceremonial purpose. Often these pipes figured heavily into diplomacy as well, and they were often presented as gifts to visiting dignitaries. And they were used to establish alliances, so they had an important political and social function as well as a religious function. The lower stem is a more typical stem from the period of around 1800. It's decorated with plated porcupine quill work. It's a fascinating image of two humans that appear to be wearing hats. This is not unique. There are a few other of these that are known. No one knows exactly what this depiction is intended to be, but the bag or the pipe itself is a beautiful example of the kind of work that was done during this period. And by that I mean 1750 to 1850. A pipe from the Osage, a long tradition of using the head of a human as the bowl. It's a wonderful, it's almost a portrait-like depiction of an Osage man. Hard to see in the photograph, but the catlinite, which is a red pipestone, the catlinite stem has 3 human hands carved in relief that I've certainly never seen before. It's a wonderful piece. And a bowl close to me that is typical of, I would say, an 1800 to 1850 bowl from this region. This is probably Eastern Sioux. The shaft ornamentation of those 3 architectural structures I've never seen before. It probably represents a village or perhaps a fort. It's inlaid with lead. Hard to see in this image, but you'll notice across the top of the bowl, the lead inlay forms a cross within the circle. Just a nice reference to the southeastern shoulder bag design that you see, and I'm sure done for the same purpose. Yes. These are pipe bowls, yes. Yeah, separated from their stems long ago. Pipes and stems were a very, very important sculptural form for the native peoples of this region that extended out onto the plains as well. And then women created the porcupine quill plating for many of these stems. And I should mention here, perhaps, that a number of objects, and you'll become more familiar as you continue to read and spend more time with the collection, but a number of these objects in the installation are collaborative objects. They were made by both men and women. And I think you know from your reading at this point. And have you been through the Thaw book? I should have asked you that early on. Okay. The book on the Thaw collection, I'd hold that close because it's, I would say, one of the most extensive and best general references that you can have. But what I was getting to is that traditionally, art, the creation of art, was defined by gender. Women made certain kinds of things, men made other kinds of things. And that was generally true into the early 20th century when those things began to change. There were some instances of role reversal in native life, which is an interesting sidelight, but Generally speaking, various art forms were made by either men or women. But in numbers of cases, like the scalp shirt that you're going to see, pipe stems, objects combined the work of both genders in a single object. This is one of the great icons of the collection, and it's an introduction to plains material, a great piece of feather work. It's an icon not only of the collection, but beginning in the late 19th century, sort of an icon of Native peoples in general. Everybody began to wear these things. When this piece was made about 1875, it would have been worn only by a man who had great military accomplishment, political stature, a recognized leader, truly a great man within the culture. The usage began to change once reservation life became pushed upon plains peoples, and feather headdresses became a kind of universal symbol, still are to a degree. But this is one of the great ones. It's from the Northern Cheyenne people, Montana, sorry. This is called a scalp shirt, and it's fringed with human hair. And there are two interpretations of this that one generally will find. One is that the scalps represent victory over foes, over slain enemies. And these are, now this shirt is not hung with scalps, it's hung with human hair. The other tradition among many tribes was that individuals within the tribe would offer a lock of hair, and the shirt, once it was made, symbolized the responsibility of the shirt wearer towards his people. And so it, whether the hair on this was taken from enemies or whether it was offered by other members of the tribe, we don't know. But it's a great example of an early historic shirt, not so early, I should say. Some of these go back to around 1800. This one dates about 1865, I believe. It's a pre-reservation shirt, possibly from the Crow in Montana, but maybe from the Plateau peoples, where there was a lot of cultural interaction and trade back and forth. It's a tobacco bag. I remember this was on view up on the third floor for a while, and we sort of had to rub the nose prints off every day on the case. Children are fascinated by this thing. It's basically an animal skin bag, and these were made in the plains as containers for tobacco, most commonly, sometimes medicines as well. But this is a black-footed ferret. Basically, the bag was turned inside out, or I should say the skin was turned inside out and tanned. The skull was left intact. It was then decorated very, very beautifully. The underside of the tail is embroidered with quill work, very elaborate and intricate suspensions hanging from it. 2 eagle talons have been attached to the side of the head to create these horns that you see, which again denotes a spirit animal. It's in wonderful condition, probably dates about 1840. And then you will see a group of tobacco bags. I have been interested in focusing on these because I think that as a beaded object, they afforded women a great deal of freedom in the expression of these bags. They're long, they're short, they're wide, thin. They're different component elements. The upper, the beaded or quilt panel, usually some treatment at the base of the fringe, and then the fringe themselves. The designs are amazing, a combination of paint, beadwork. And you can line up many of these, and each one is very, very distinctive. These two are from Oklahoma, Cheyenne on the far image, Arapaho. I love the fact that this Arapaho bag has an image of turtles and thunderbirds, just like the Delaware bag that was made about 100 years earlier. It's a nice connection. The man, I should say, the man on the other bag, it's a single figure surrounded by thunderbirds. Photographs that show Cheyenne and Arapaho dancers, sometimes ghost dancers, but other dancers, show men standing in place with their arms raised in prayer. And I believe that that is what this image is depicting. So it's a single person. On the reverse side, it's a red figure. This is a black one, surrounded by spirit helpers. The image is pretty clear. Kiowa bag, close to me, a highly stylized landscape. Celestial figure, probably the morning star, occupying the central part of the bag. The other bag comes from Kansas City Museum, and it belonged to a very important leader named Black Kettle, who was killed at Washita. And this was made by his niece. She managed to get it out of the village when it was attacked by Custer's troops, and it's come down. It was collected eventually in Oklahoma, and it's come down to Kansas City, and I think it's a piece very, very rich in history and a beautiful object. An early tobacco bag close to me, a stripe-style bag dating about 1840, showing kind of the beginnings of the tradition. And then on the far image is a Tobacco Society bag from the Crow, a very, very early example of pictographic beadwork. Was collected in northern Wyoming in 1866. Comes from the Diker collection. The color that you see, it's made of buffalo hide, colored with red pigment, sacred red pigment. Two creatures, probably otters, that face each other. I can't tell you too much more about the symbolism of the design, except there we see again the circle with the cross within it. And it's worth noting that many of the religious concepts and I would say religious iconography extended from the woodlands into the plains. Many of the plains tribes plains culture emerging through the horse, many of the plains tribes moved from the woodlands out onto the plains in the 1700s. And so they took a lot of the ideas with them. And these evolved into new and different forms. Two small bags, just little jewels, belt pouches basically. Native clothing had no pockets, and a variety of materials were made, or a variety of containers were made for personal effects. These are just exquisite little things. A larger case for toiletries or documents. They're called dispatch bags. This is the image on your left, which is a fairly large-scale bag, beautifully executed in beadwork from the Arapaho people, Oklahoma. And then on the far image, a pair of buffalo horn-rim glasses from contemporary artist Kevin Pouillet. He's a Lakota. There's a lot of irony in these glasses. You can't see it in this image, but on the inside, it's engraved Resban. And he, as whimsical as these might seem, the materials that he uses, beginning with the buffalo horn, it's believed that the Lakota believe the soul of the buffalo resides within their horn. And so, right at the beginning, he's using a material that has sacred associations. And then this is very, very carefully engraved with a kind of sparkling mother-of-pearl looking material that's actually a sandstone that comes from the Badlands. The red comes from an area around the Black Hills called the Buffalo's Racetrack. And again, in the materials that you see, there are sacred associations within this object that was made within the last 2 years. And the designs emanate very directly from traditional Lakota bead and quillwork designs. And again, we have this long-standing tradition of art and function as a single entity. Two painted rawhide containers called parfleche, one of the great women's painting traditions of North America. These were produced throughout the western half. They were associated with horse culture, the nomadic cultures of the plains people. And the one close to me dates about 1850, Cheyenne. In contrast, a Lakota piece dating about 1885, just to represent the range of this tradition. Most of what exists dates from 1850 to about 1920 in this material, but they're and again, when we think about gender, women traditionally produced geometric painting in the Plains area, and this was the principal form of expression. They also painted beautiful buffalo robes. A great piece of Plains sculpture, it's a cording flute in the effigy of an elk, a calling elk. It was a creature that was associated with passion, with, I'd just say love, passion. Young men played these flutes, composed songs, in courtship. This is one of two that I'm aware of that have an elk's head as the terminating feature. This one is far and away the best. I think it's probably one of the great pieces of plain sculpture in existence. Cradles, beaded cradles, a toy cradle by Joyce Growing Thunder Fogarty on the far image, very much patterned after traditional cradles that were made in the 19th century. The one close to me has been in the collection a long time. It's created by a woman named Tado, who was one of the most celebrated cradle makers among the Kiowa people in the late 19th century, and it's an absolute masterpiece of beadwork and construction design. Beautiful little doll, speaks for itself, from the Kansas City Museum. Made for a little girl, I'm sure, although many of these were made for collectors that were visiting the reservations at the time. Two pieces of clothing. On the far image is a Crow boy's shirt, and close to me is a Lakota vest, fully beaded vest. And what, besides the fact that these are very, very beautiful, they also represent really a design system, if you want to think of it that way, that has been expressed in a different medium. The boy's shirt, the central panel with the two diamond hourglass motifs side by side, could have been lifted directly from a painted parfleche. It's a classic kind of Crow painted design, and here it's executed in beadwork. And the man's vest next to me is a beaded version of the kind of men's pictographic, autobiographical drawing that was used on robes and shirts at an earlier time. A woman's dance cape, made at a time when Native women were wearing European dresses, and so this beaded cape could simply fit over the top for ceremonial occasions. Beautiful little girl's belt, again from the Kansas City Museum, sort of a legendary piece within the field. It was made for a 3-year-old, bought by Mrs. Dyer, and it's just hung with a profusion of bags and whetstone cases and pouches and little amulets, and very, very beautiful little thing. Kiowa woman's boots close to me, just a great example of the kinds of boots that Southern Plains women wore. This pair is especially distinguished by the elaborate painting that you see, exquisite beadwork. They're amazingly beautiful. And then on the far image is a pair of women's moccasins with a very, very interesting image, which depicts a mythic heroine figure called Double Woman. And you can see that there are two figures here. They're upside down. They're joined by, they're each holding a rope from which is suspended a kind of ball at the end. Double Woman was basically the mythic culture heroine from which all artistic inspiration originated. And she would appear to Lakota women in their dreams, give these women ideas for designs, hence the sacred association of these designs. And when Double Woman was depicted within ceremonies, she was embodied by two women that were regarded as particularly blessed, and they would move together and they would be joined by a rope from which was suspended either a ball or a tiny doll. And that is what the image that you see on these moccasins is about. Work bag, I'm going to move on. 4 peyote fans from the Native American church. Beautiful examples of feather work that began in the late 19th century and is very much alive today, as is the Native American church. These are all from the early 20th century. Some war implements, a horned headdress from the Pawnee, very rare piece, close to me. And on the far image is a lance, or what looks like a lance. I don't think it was used for stabbing. I think it was used for touching the enemy. It might be a warrior society object. When I say touching the enemy, that's called counting coup. It was regarded as the highest war honor. But when you look at this thing, you'll notice right down by the painted head, there's a woodpecker beak and scalp attached. There is dyed horsehair, all kinds of delicate suspensions. So this would not have been used as a thrusting weapon. It was used more as a staff of office, perhaps in a warrior society, but certainly was used as a coup stick when carried into battle. This is one of those things that doesn't look like much in an image, but when you see the real thing, it's like it's alive. It has these 2 small expansions that are on the shaft that would have served to help hold it. But more than that, it transforms this thing into almost an animal-like presence. It's like it has a skeletal presence within it. And it's very, very early, probably 1825 to 1850. And I can't tell you the tribe. 2 horse sticks. Plains warriors would often memorialize horses that were killed in battle, that were actually trusted dear companions in battle. And these horses were honored. The sticks were carried in dances. And here we have a contemporary version and what may be the earliest horse stick that I've ever seen. On the top is a Lakota staff that was created about 1865. It's 5.5 feet long. It's carved from a single piece of wood, and the most amazing abstraction of a lunging, galloping horse that I have seen in Plains sculpture. Below is a piece by contemporary Lakota artist Butch Thunderhawk. He has used as his inspiration the carvings of a 19th century sculptor or carver named No Two Horns, who was an Unkpapa Lakota like himself. He went to visit the family to get the right to essentially reproduce a piece in the style of No Two Horns. And this depicts No Two Horns' famous blue roan horse that was killed in battle. Sticks of this kind are made for powwow dancers today, primarily, and also collectors, but they emerged straight out of the 19th century tradition. I'm going to see what else we have here. Knife sheath and belt. This is one of the great pieces on view. It's a dress that was worn by a woman named Silent Woman. It depicts the war episodes of Bobtail Bear, who was a relative killed in battle, and it's painted on both sides with the kind of pictographic traditional images that one sees in Plains painting. This was men's art. We have 2 examples, this great dress, and I'm going to go on here, and close to me this ledger book by Silverhorn, which is the earliest book he is known to have produced. And it's a book filled with drawings, not only of battle scenes, but basically all of Kiowa life. I'm going to go back a minute. One of the great visionary paintings to come out of Plains culture. It's the shield. It's been written about. You probably read what I would have to say about it. It's, again, one of the great kind of icons of the collection, made about 1850 from the Arikara people. On the far image is a winter count or a calendar that you should be able to have some fun with. Each one of those little boxes depicts a year by which that year was known, and we have much of that information for you. And there we are. So, and I'm 4 minutes over. I have no idea what any of that, so was that helpful to you? Was it really? Well, do you have any questions? Any questions? No, thanks. No. Yes?
You're talking about that used to touch the enemy, so
Yeah.
it wasn't a requirement that the Native American actually touch the body. He was fixing something to his dead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, although they touched with the hand, with the question was, in a staff used to touch an enemy in battle, they were not touching with their hand, they were touching with an implement that extended the hand, and yes, that...
Was this before they actually killed the person or tried to kill the person, or after? Because it didn't come up.
Well, warfare was highly structured in Plains culture. There were a lot of rules around it, and it was the primary means by which a man gained prestige. And so war honors were ranked accordingly, and the highest honor was to touch an enemy, not necessarily kill the enemy. The idea was that it was the most dangerous thing that one could do, was to strike an armed enemy, or any kind of an enemy, either with a club or a stick for that purpose, or one's hand, or a gun, or a bow, or anything else. And in a lot of the narratives that you will read, a lot of times when men would charge on the enemies, the first there would strike the enemy, and then someone else would come up and actually dispatch the person. I mean, it went all kinds of ways, but counting coup was the most highly regarded of all the war honors, and so, and it didn't matter really what you touched them with, as long as you did it, because they were the most dangerous at that, you know.
How intimidating was that to the Anglo-European to be touched at close proximity when they were engaged in fighting? I mean, I would imagine.
I don't know. It probably was, I don't know. It's a different, I mean, that's a longer conversation, but warfare in Plains culture served a different purpose than Euro-American warfare. A lot of Plains warfare had to do with, I mean, certainly there was killing, and there was a lot of killing involved, but it did not deal with the idea of extermination and, you know, or conquering. It was more a back and forth kind of struggle, although there was certainly, you know, anything else? Okay, thanks. See you this afternoon. We're going upstairs.